In the heart of the Middle East, a conflict rages that has captured the world's attention for generations. It is a story of two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, locked in a bitter struggle over a small strip of land that both consider their homeland. This is not a distant historical dispute confined to dusty textbooks. It is a living, breathing crisis that unfolds daily on our screens, in our headlines, and in the lives of millions. The sounds of sirens, the images of rubble, and the faces of grieving families have become tragically familiar, yet the complexity of the situation often leaves the world feeling divided, confused, and heartbroken. Understanding this conflict is not just an academic exercise. It is essential for comprehending the dynamics of global politics, religion, and human rights. Today, on May 24, 2024, the conflict feels more urgent and more intractable than ever. The latest cycle of violence has brought unimaginable suffering, pushing any hope for a peaceful resolution further into the distance. For Israelis, the fear of rocket attacks and the existential threat from hostile neighbors is a constant reality. For Palestinians, the daily experience is one of occupation, displacement, and the loss of land and dignity. This is a conflict where both sides see themselves as victims, and both sides have powerful, deeply ingrained narratives that justify their actions and their claims. These narratives are not just stories, they are the bedrock of national identity, forged in the fires of history, war, and collective trauma. This essay is not an attempt to declare a winner or assign ultimate blame. The goal is not to decide who is right and who is wrong, as such a judgment would ignore the profound and genuine grievances on both sides. Instead, our purpose is to provide a comprehensive and balanced explanation. We will journey through the history, the politics, and the human stories that define this struggle. We will explore how a conflict over land became intertwined with religious fervor, geopolitical strategy, and the clashing ambitions of regional and global powers. By examining the key events and turning points from multiple perspectives, we can begin to understand the forces that continue to fuel the fire. To truly grasp the roots of the conflict, we must look beyond the immediate headlines of bombings and ceasefires. We will trace the story back, not just to the creation of Israel in 1948, but thousands of years into the past, to the ancient land of Canaan. We will examine the birth of Zionism in 19th century Europe, the promises and betrayals of colonial powers during World War I, and the catastrophic impact of the Holocaust. We will also explore the rise of Palestinian nationalism and the profound sense of loss known as the Nakba. This is a story of promises made and broken, of dreams fulfilled and dreams shattered, and it is a story that continues to shape our world today. At the very core of this conflict lies a fundamental, almost impossible dilemma. Two national movements lay claim to the same small piece of territory. For the Jewish people, this land is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, promised to their ancestors by God as recorded in the Hebrew Bible. It is the cradle of their civilization, the site of their ancient kingdoms, and the focal point of their spiritual identity for millennia. The longing to return to Zion, a synonym for Jerusalem and the land of Israel, has been a central tenet of Jewish life throughout a long and often painful diaspora. This connection is not merely symbolic. It is deeply embedded in their prayers, their culture, and their historical consciousness. For the Palestinian people, this land is Philistine, their ancestral home for centuries. They are the descendants of the many peoples who lived in the region over the course of history, including the Canaanites, Philistines, and Arabs, who arrived with the spread of Islam in the 7th century. Their identity is inextricably linked to the land's olive groves, its ancient cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, and Nablus, and the villages their families have inhabited for generations. Before the political turmoil of the 20th century, they lived in a society of Muslims, Christians, and a small Jewish population, developing their own distinct culture, dialect, and connection to the sacred landscape. To them, the arrival of a new national movement felt like an invasion by outsiders. The conflict, therefore, cannot be simplified as a purely religious war. Though religion plays a significant role, it is fundamentally a clash between two competing nationalisms. Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as a modern political movement, arguing that the Jewish people, facing relentless persecution in Europe, needed their own sovereign state to ensure their survival. Similarly, Palestinian nationalism began to crystallize in the early 20th century in response to the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the growing waves of Zionist immigration. Both movements sought self-determination and statehood on the very same soil, setting them on an inevitable collision course. Understanding these parallel narratives is crucial. For Israelis, the story is one of a miraculous return from exile, of building a vibrant democracy and a thriving economy against all odds, and of defending their existence in a hostile neighborhood. It is a story of national liberation and self-reliance. For Palestinians, the story is one of colonization, dispossession, and ongoing occupation. It is a story of losing their homeland, becoming refugees, and struggling for basic rights and statehood. These two realities are not mutually exclusive. They are two sides of the same tragic history, experienced and interpreted in profoundly different ways. Our journey will explore how these perspectives were formed and how they continue to shape the conflict. Side. While the Israel-Palestine conflict is rooted in a local dispute over land, it has never been a purely local affair. From its earliest days, it has been a global flashpoint, drawing in empires, superpowers, and international organizations. The strategic location of the region, at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, has always made it a prize for external powers. In the 20th century, the interests of the British and French empires, and later the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, profoundly shaped the course of events. Promises made in London, decisions made in Washington, and vetoes cast in Moscow have often had more impact on the ground than the actions of the local inhabitants themselves. The conflict's international dimension is also fueled by its immense religious significance. Jerusalem is a holy city for three of the world's major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For Jews, it is the site of the ancient temples and the eternal capital of their people. For Christians, it is where Jesus preached, was crucified, and resurrected. For Muslims, it is the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to heaven, and the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina. This concentration of sacredness means that any flare-up in Jerusalem can send shockwaves across the globe, mobilizing billions of believers and turning a political dispute into a matter of divine importance. In recent decades, the conflict's geometry has shifted. It is no longer just about Israel versus its immediate Arab neighbors. A new, powerful player has entered the arena: Iran. Following its Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran adopted a fiercely anti-Israel ideology, viewing the state as an illegitimate outpost of Western imperialism. Unable to confront Israel directly, Iran has cultivated a network of proxy forces across the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. This has transformed the conflict into a broader, more dangerous confrontation, a shadow war fought with missiles, drones, and cyber attacks, raising the stakes for the entire Middle East and beyond. Therefore, understanding this conflict requires us to zoom out and see the larger picture. We must consider the role of U.S. foreign policy, the influence of powerful lobbying groups, the dynamics of the global energy market, and the evolving alliances in a rapidly changing Middle East. The conflict is a central issue in international law, raising questions about occupation, human rights, and the laws of war. It is a constant source of debate on university campuses, in newsrooms, and in the halls of power. It is a conflict that implicates us all, forcing us to confront difficult questions about justice, history, and our shared humanity. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper dive into these complex layers. To understand the depth of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, we must travel back in time, not just centuries but millennia. Our story begins in the ancient Near East, in a land known as Canaan, a territory nestled between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This was a crossroads of civilizations, a fertile crescent that saw the rise and fall of countless empires. According to the Hebrew Bible, it is here, approximately 4,000 years ago, that a man named Abraham from the city of Ur, in modern-day Iraq, embarked on a journey that would change the course of history. He is considered the patriarch, the founding father, not only of Judaism but also of Christianity and Islam, a figure of immense spiritual significance. According to the book of Genesis, Abraham received a divine call, a command from a single, unseen God, a revolutionary concept in a polytheistic world. This God made a covenant, or a sacred agreement, with him. The promise was twofold. First, that Abraham would become the father of a great nation, with descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Second, and crucially for our story, God promised this nation a homeland, the land of Canaan. This divine grant of land is a foundational element of Jewish identity. Whether viewed as historical fact, sacred scripture, or national mythology, this promise has echoed through the ages, forming an unbreakable bond between the Jewish people and this specific geographical place. From Abraham came his son Isaac, and from Isaac came Jacob, who, after a mysterious wrestling match with a divine being, was renamed Israel. The name itself, meaning one who struggles with God, encapsulates a core theme of Jewish history and theology. Jacob had 12 sons, and their families would become the fabled 12 tribes of Israel. The narrative continues with a severe famine sweeping across Canaan, forcing the nascent Israelite people to seek refuge in the fertile lands of Egypt. Initially welcomed as guests, their status changed over the generations. As their numbers grew, the Egyptian pharaohs began to see them as a threat, and the Israelites were systematically enslaved, forced into hard labor, building cities for their masters. This period of enslavement is a pivotal chapter in the Jewish story, a narrative of suffering and oppression that would become a recurring theme in their history. The memory of bondage in Egypt forged a collective identity rooted in the experience of persecution and the yearning for freedom. This deep-seated historical trauma would later be commemorated annually in the Festival of Passover, a celebration of liberation that reminds every generation of their journey from slavery to freedom. The stage was set for a dramatic deliverance, a moment when the promise made to Abraham would be put to the ultimate test, requiring divine intervention and a leader of extraordinary courage and faith to guide them back to the promised land. After centuries of bondage in Egypt, the biblical narrative introduces one of its most towering figures, Moses. Raised in the Pharaoh's court but born an Israelite, Moses was chosen by God to lead his people out of slavery. The story of the Exodus is a cornerstone of Jewish faith, a dramatic tale of plagues, a parted sea, and divine liberation. After their escape, the Israelites wandered for 40 years in the Sinai desert, a period of trial and transformation. It was during this time at the foot of Mount Sinai that Moses is said to have received the Torah, including the Ten Commandments, a set of moral and religious laws that would become the ethical foundation for Judaism and much of Western civilization. This was the moment the Israelites were forged into a nation, bound not by a king or a territory, but by a shared law and a covenant with God. Eventually, the Israelites, led by Moses' successor Joshua, re-entered the land of Canaan. The biblical account describes a period of conquest and settlement, followed by centuries of loose tribal confederation, ruled by a series of leaders known as judges. However, facing constant threats from neighboring peoples, most notably the Philistines, the tribes recognized the need for a more unified leadership. Around 1000 BCE, they anointed their first king, Saul, establishing a united monarchy. Saul's reign was followed by that of King David, who conquered the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it his capital, transforming it from a hilltop fortress into the political and spiritual heart of the Israelite nation. It was David's son, King Solomon, whose reign is remembered as a golden age of peace, prosperity, and architectural splendor. Solomon's most celebrated achievement was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This was no ordinary building. It was to be the permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, which housed the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, and the singular central site for sacrificial worship. The temple became the ultimate symbol of Jewish national identity and religious life. It was the physical manifestation of the covenant, the place where heaven and earth met, and the focal point of pilgrimage festivals that brought Jews from all 12 tribes together, cementing their shared culture and faith. However, this golden age was not to last. After Solomon's death, his kingdom, strained by heavy taxes and internal rivalries, fractured. It split into two weaker nations, the northern kingdom of Israel comprising 10 of the tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, home to the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. This division fatally weakened the Israelites, leaving them vulnerable to the ambitions of the great empires rising around them. The political unity was shattered, but the spiritual idea of a united people in their promised land, with Jerusalem as their eternal capital, would endure, becoming a powerful memory and a future hope during the long, dark centuries of exile that were to come. The division of the Israelite monarchy into two separate kingdoms marked the beginning of a long and painful decline. Weakened by internal strife and political instability, both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah became pawns in the great power struggles of the ancient Near East. The first to fall was the Northern Kingdom. In 722 BCE, the mighty Assyrian Empire swept down from Mesopotamia, conquering the Kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria. Following their standard policy, the Assyrians deported a large portion of the Israelite population, scattering them throughout their vast empire. These became known as the 10 Lost Tribes, their historical fate a subject of legend and speculation to this day. The southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital Jerusalem, managed to survive for over a century longer. But it was living on borrowed time. It found itself caught between the waning power of Assyria, the rising might of Babylon, and the influence of Egypt to the south. Despite the warnings of prophets like Jeremiah, who urged political submission to avoid catastrophe, the kings of Judah often engaged in risky rebellions. In 597 BCE, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, responded to one such revolt by laying siege to Jerusalem. He captured the city, plundered the first temple, and deported the Judean king and thousands of the kingdom's elite, its officials, craftsmen, and leading citizens, to Babylon. This was only the beginning. A decade later, in 586 BCE, after a final, desperate rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar returned with his full military force. This time, there was no mercy. The city of Jerusalem was razed to the ground, its walls torn down. The magnificent Temple of Solomon, the heart of Jewish spiritual life for 4 centuries, was utterly destroyed by fire. Another, larger wave of the Judean population was forcibly marched into exile in Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian captivity, was a national trauma of unparalleled proportions. It represented the complete loss of everything that had defined them, their land, their sovereignty, their capital, and their sacred temple. It was a moment of existential crisis that could have easily spelled the end of the Jewish people. Yet it was in the crucible of exile that Judaism underwent a profound transformation, one that would ensure its survival. Deprived of their temple and its sacrificial rites, the exiled Judeans, now known simply as Jews, were forced to find new ways to practice their faith. They turned to prayer, the study of their sacred texts, the Torah, and communal gathering. The institution of the synagogue began to take shape as a local center for worship and learning. It was during this period that the Hebrew Bible was edited and canonized, preserving the laws, stories, and prophecies that formed their identity. They remembered their homeland with an intense longing, famously expressed in Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. This memory would become a powerful force for survival. The Babylonian exile ended in 539 BCE when the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. In a remarkable act of religious tolerance, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, Judah, now a province of Persia known as Yehud, and to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Not all Jews chose to return. A significant community remained in Babylon, establishing the first major Jewish diaspora community. Those who did return, however, began the arduous task of reconstruction. The Second Temple was completed around 516 BCE. While perhaps not as grand as Solomon's, it once again became the center of Jewish religious and national life for the next several centuries. Over the following centuries, the land of Judea was passed from one empire to another. After the Persians came the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, and then his successors, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids. This period of Hellenistic rule brought Greek culture and ideas into conflict with Jewish traditions, culminating in the Maccabean Revolt of the 2nd century BCE, a successful uprising that led to a brief period of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. However, internal conflicts weakened the Hasmonean state, paving the way for a new, even more formidable power to assert its dominance over the region: Rome. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey captured Jerusalem, and Judea became a client state of the expanding Roman Empire. Roman rule was often brutal and insensitive to Jewish religious customs, leading to simmering resentment and frequent unrest. Tensions finally boiled over in 66 CE when a full-scale Jewish rebellion, known as the Great Jewish Revolt, erupted against Roman authority. The Roman response was swift and ruthless. The legions, led by the future emperors Vespasian and his son Titus, methodically crushed the rebellion. In the year 70 CE, after a long and horrific siege, they conquered Jerusalem. As they had done centuries before, the invaders destroyed the city and, most devastatingly, reduced the Second Temple to rubble. all that remained was a portion of the outer retaining wall, which would later become known as the Western Wall, the holiest site in modern Judaism. The destruction of the Second Temple was an even greater catastrophe than the first. It marked the definitive end of the Jewish state in antiquity and the end of the temple-based, sacrificial form of Judaism. Following another failed revolt under Bar Kokhba in 135 CE, the Roman Emperor Hadrian crushed the last vestiges of Jewish autonomy. He renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and the province of Judea-Syria Palestina, in part to erase its Jewish identity. Jews were barred from living in Jerusalem. This final crushing defeat triggered the Great Diaspora. Jews were scattered across the Roman Empire and beyond, exiled from their homeland and forced to build new lives as a landless minority. The era of exile, which had begun centuries earlier, now became the defining condition of the Jewish people for nearly 2,000 years. For the next 2 millennia, the Jewish people lived as a scattered nation, a collection of communities spread across the globe. The diaspora took them to every corner of the known world, from the bustling cities of the Roman Empire to the trading posts of the Silk Road, from the scholarly academies of Babylon to the emerging kingdoms of Europe. Without a state or a central authority, the question of survival became paramount. How could a people maintain a distinct identity while living as a minority among often hostile majority cultures? The answer lay in a portable homeland they could carry with them, their texts, their laws, and their traditions. Rabbinic Judaism, which had begun to develop after the first exile, now became the dominant force, providing a framework for Jewish life in any land. Synagogues became the local epicenters of Jewish life, serving as houses of prayer, community centers, and schools for children. The rabbis, scholars who interpreted Jewish law and tradition, became the leaders of the communities. They compiled the Talmud, a vast compendium of law, ethics, and stories that became the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, guiding every aspect of daily life from diet, kashrut, to business ethics to holiday observances. This shared legal and cultural framework created a powerful sense of unity among Jewish communities, no matter how geographically distant. They maintained Hebrew as a sacred language for prayer and study, while also developing unique vernaculars like Yiddish in Eastern Europe and Ladino in the Sephardic world, blending Hebrew with local languages. This period of exile was also marked by a profound and persistent longing for return. The memory of Zion, the historical land of Israel, was not allowed to fade. It was woven into the fabric of daily prayer and yearly ritual. 3 times a day, observant Jews would pray facing Jerusalem. At the end of the Passover Seder and the fast of Yom Kippur, they would recite the hopeful phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." This was more than a nostalgic sentiment. It was a deeply held belief, a theological and national conviction, that the exile was temporary, and that one day, God would gather the Jewish people from the 4 corners of the earth and bring them back to their ancestral homeland. This messianic hope provided comfort and resilience in the face of immense hardship. However, life in the diaspora was rarely easy. Jewish communities often existed at the mercy of their host nations. They experienced periods of relative tolerance and prosperity, particularly in places like Moorish Spain and parts of the Ottoman Empire, where they made significant contributions to science, philosophy, and commerce. But these golden ages were often followed by periods of intense persecution. Treated as outsiders and Christ-killers in much of Christian Europe, they were subjected to forced conversions, expulsions, and violent massacres known as pogroms. They were confined to ghettos, barred from owning land, and scapegoated for society's ills. This long and painful history of persecution would ultimately fuel a new, modern political movement to end the exile once and for all. As the 19th century dawned, it seemed to promise a new era of enlightenment and emancipation for the Jews of Europe. The walls of the ghettos began to crumble as the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, spread across the continent. Jews were gradually granted civil rights, allowed to enter universities, and participate in the economic and cultural life of their host nations. Many embraced this opportunity with enthusiasm, seeking to assimilate and prove themselves as loyal Frenchmen, Germans, or Austrians, who simply happened to practice a different faith. They excelled in science, arts, finance, and philosophy, becoming prominent figures in European society. It was a time of great hope, a belief that the long, dark night of religious persecution was finally coming to an end. However, this newfound freedom was fragile and in many ways illusory. While old forms of religious anti-Judaism persisted, a new and more insidious form of hatred began to take root: modern anti-Semitism. This was not just about religious differences anymore, it was racial and political. Drawing on the emerging, twisted theories of social Darwinism and racial science, anti-Semites began to argue that Jews were not just followers of a different religion but members of a distinct, inferior, and unchangeable race. They were depicted as a foreign element, an alien presence within the nation-state that could never truly belong or be loyal. This new ideology was particularly potent in an age of rising nationalism, where identity was increasingly defined by shared blood, language, and soil. This racial anti-Semitism was coupled with a host of conspiracy theories. Jews were blamed for the perceived evils of modernity, from the disruptive forces of capitalism to the revolutionary fervor of communism. They were portrayed as clandestine manipulators, pulling the strings of global finance and media to serve their own secret agenda for world domination, a slander famously promoted in the forged text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In Western Europe, this manifested as social ostracism and political agitation. In Eastern Europe, particularly within the vast and oppressive Russian Empire where the majority of the world's Jews lived, it took a far more violent form. The state not only tolerated but actively encouraged anti-Semitism as a way to deflect popular anger from the failures of the Tsarist regime. This policy culminated in brutal state-sponsored riots known as pogroms. From the 1880s onwards, waves of horrific violence were unleashed upon Jewish towns and villages. Mobs, often incited by local authorities and the clergy, would descend upon Jewish communities, looting and burning homes and businesses, and indiscriminately murdering men, women, and children. These massacres shattered the illusion of safety and progress. They were a terrifying message to the millions of Jews in the Russian Pale of Settlement that their lives were precarious and that neither the law nor their neighbors would protect them. It became devastatingly clear that assimilation was not a viable path to safety. This climate of hate, violence, and insecurity created a desperate need for a radical new solution to what was being called the Jewish question. In the midst of this rising tide of European anti-Semitism, a charismatic and assimilated Austro-Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl experienced a moment of profound awakening. Herzl was a thoroughly modern, secular European man. He was a celebrated playwright and a correspondent for a prominent Vienna newspaper. He believed, like many of his contemporaries, that the solution to the Jewish question was complete assimilation. However, his perspective was irrevocably altered while he was covering the infamous Dreyfus affair in Paris in 1894. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish captain in the French army, was falsely convicted of treason in a trial fueled by blatant anti-Semitism. As Herzl watched French crowds chant "Death to the Jews," in the supposed cradle of liberty he had a chilling realization. Herzl concluded that anti-Semitism was an inescapable and permanent feature of European society. It was not a relic of a less enlightened age but an integral part of modern nationalism. He realized that no matter how patriotic, cultured, or assimilated Jews became, they would always be seen as the other, the eternal scapegoat. If this could happen in France, the most liberal and advanced nation in Europe, it could happen anywhere. The dream of assimilation was a dangerous illusion. Herzl became convinced that the only possible solution was for the Jewish people to escape Europe altogether and establish their own sovereign nation-state where they could live in safety and dignity, free from persecution. This was the only way to normalize their existence. In 1896, Herzl laid out his revolutionary idea in a short, powerful pamphlet titled Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State. In it, he argued that the Jewish people were not merely a religious community but a nation. And like any other nation, they were entitled to a territory of their own, with a government, an army, and a flag. This was a radical departure from the traditional religious hope of a messianic return to Zion. Herzl's vision was political, practical, and urgent. He called for an organized international political movement to secure a charter for a Jewish homeland from one of the great powers of the day. This political movement became known as Zionism, a term that had been coined earlier but which Herzl imbued with a new, powerful political energy. Herzl worked tirelessly to turn his vision into a reality. In 1897 he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, bringing together Jewish delegates from 17 countries. This event was a watershed moment, creating the institutional framework for the Zionist movement, including the World Zionist Organization. In his diary, Herzl famously wrote, "After the Congress at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." While Herzl considered various locations for this state, including parts of Argentina and Uganda, the overwhelming emotional and historical pull was toward one place, Palestine, the ancient biblical homeland, the land of Zion. The stage was now set for the Jewish people's political return. While Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement were formulating their plans in the drawing rooms and conference halls of Europe, the land they dreamed of was far from empty. At the turn of the 20th century, Palestine was a distinct, albeit underdeveloped province within the vast and aging Ottoman Empire. It was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society that had been inhabited continuously for centuries. The overwhelming majority of the population, estimated at around 600,000 people, were Arabic-speaking Muslims. They were primarily fellahin, or peasants, living in hundreds of small villages, their lives tied to the agricultural cycles of olive, grain, and citrus cultivation. Their connection to the land was deep, rooted in generations of family history and local tradition. Alongside the Muslim majority lived a significant and long-established Arab Christian community, numbering around 10% of the population. These communities were concentrated in cities like Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, and they were often well-educated and prominent in commerce and the professions. There was also a small Druze population in the north, as well as other minority groups. And importantly, there was a pre-existing Jewish population. These were mostly Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors had found refuge in the Ottoman Empire after being expelled from Spain in 1492, and deeply religious Ashkenazi Jews who had come to the four holy cities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias, to study and to die. This old Yishuv, or Old Jewish community, numbered around 25,000 and generally lived peacefully alongside their Arab neighbors. The society was largely traditional and organized around clans and notable families who dominated the major towns like Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa. Most of the land was owned either by these wealthy, urban-based absentee landlords or was held as communal village land. For the average Palestinian peasant, identity was primarily local, defined by one's village, family, and religion. However, the winds of change were beginning to blow. The 19th century reforms of the Ottoman Empire and the increasing influence of European powers were starting to foster a new sense of collective identity. A nascent Arab nationalism was beginning to stir throughout the Ottoman domains, a desire for independence from Turkish rule and the creation of a modern Arab state or states. It was into this complex and evolving society that the first waves of Zionist immigrants would arrive. The Palestine they found was not the land without a people for a people without a land, as an early Zionist slogan misleadingly claimed. It was a populated country, with its own social structures, economy, and a people who, while not yet possessing a fully formed modern national consciousness, saw the land as their home. The arrival of ideologically driven European settlers, who spoke different languages, had different customs, and harbored a clear political goal of creating a Jewish national entity, was bound to create friction. The seeds of the future conflict were being planted in the soil of Ottoman Palestine long before the first shot was ever fired. Even before Theodor Herzl published The Jewish State, the pogroms in the Russian Empire had already spurred the first significant wave of modern Jewish immigration to Palestine. This wave, known as the First Aliyah, a Hebrew word meaning ascent, took place between 1882 and 1903. It brought approximately 35,000 Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, to the shores of the Ottoman-controlled territory. These were not the deeply religious Jews of the old Yishuv who came to pray, but idealistic pioneers, members of movements like Hovevai Zion or Lovers of Zion. They were driven by a mixture of nationalist fervor and a desperate flight from persecution, seeking to physically reclaim the land of their ancestors and transform it through Jewish labor. These early pioneers faced immense hardships. The land they acquired was often of poor quality, swampy, rocky, or barren, and purchased at high prices from wealthy absentee Arab landlords who lived far away in cities like Beirut or Damascus. The immigrants were unaccustomed to the climate, unfamiliar with the local farming techniques, and susceptible to diseases like malaria. Many of their early agricultural settlements, or moshavot, struggled to survive. They were kept afloat largely by the financial backing of wealthy Jewish philanthropists from the West, most notably Baron Edmond de Rothschild of Paris. His patronage helped establish wineries, farms, and new towns like Rishon LeZion and Zikron Yaakov, laying the groundwork for a future Jewish economy. A second, more ideologically driven wave, the Second Aliyah, arrived between 1904 and 1914, bringing another 40,000 immigrants, again mostly from Russia, following another round of pogroms. These newcomers were deeply influenced by socialist ideas circulating in Europe. They were young, secular, and fiercely idealistic. They sought not just to build a homeland, but to create a new utopian Jewish society based on principles of equality and collective labor. They established the first kibbutzim, collective agricultural communities where all property was shared and decisions were made democratically. They also championed the idea of Hebrew labor, insisting that Jewish enterprises should hire only Jewish workers, a principle intended to build a self-sufficient Jewish economy, but which inevitably created economic tension with the local Arab population who were displaced from jobs. This period saw the creation of foundational institutions for the future state. In 1909, a group of families purchased a stretch of sand dunes north of the ancient port of Jaffa and established a new modern Jewish city which they named Tel Aviv, the Hill of Spring. Hebrew, which had been a purely liturgical language for centuries, was revived as a modern spoken tongue, a remarkable linguistic achievement that became a powerful unifying force for immigrants from diverse backgrounds. Jewish political parties, self-defense organizations like Hash Homer, and a comprehensive school system were all established. A new Jewish society, the new Yeshuv, was taking root and growing, parallel to, but increasingly separate from, the surrounding Arab society. The growing Zionist presence in Palestine did not go unnoticed by the local Arab population. Initially, reactions were mixed. Some Arab landowners and merchants welcomed the influx of European capital and the economic development that came with it. The Jewish immigrants brought new farming techniques, established industries, and created jobs, leading to a degree of prosperity in some areas. However, this initial period of cautious coexistence soon gave way to growing apprehension and resentment. The most immediate source of conflict was over land. As Zionist organizations like the Jewish National Fund purchased large tracts of land for settlement, they often did so from absentee landlords legally and for a fair price. The problem was that this land was often worked by Palestinian tenant farmers who had lived on it for generations, believing they had a customary right to be there. When the land was sold, these farmers and their families were frequently evicted, with nowhere else to go. This created a growing class of landless, dispossessed peasants who drifted to the cities, harboring a deep sense of injustice. The Zionist principle of Hebrew labor, which sought to build an exclusively Jewish workforce, further exacerbated tensions. Arab workers found themselves shut out of jobs on Jewish farms and in Jewish enterprises, leading to economic friction and a sense of being colonized by the newcomers who seemed determined to build a separate, self-contained society. As the Zionist movement became more organized and its political goal of statehood became clearer, Arab anxieties intensified. The Arab elite, intellectuals, journalists, and politicians began to sound the alarm. They saw Zionism not as a religious movement of returning pilgrims, but as a European colonial project aimed at dispossessing the indigenous population and taking over their country. Newspapers in Jaffa and Haifa began publishing articles warning of the Zionist danger. This fear helped to catalyze a distinct Palestinian Arab nationalism. What had been a localized identity was beginning to transform into a broader political consciousness, united in opposition to the Zionist project and in its aspiration for an independent Arab future, free from both Ottoman and European control. Thus, even before the outbreak of World War I, the fundamental contours of the conflict were already sharply defined. Two national movements, both with legitimate historical narratives and deep emotional attachments to the same land, were set on a direct collision course. Zionism was a movement born of centuries of Jewish persecution, a desperate and determined effort to find a safe haven. Palestinian nationalism was a movement born of an indigenous people's resistance to what they perceived as an existential threat to their homes and their future. The conflict was not yet one of armies and states, but of competing dreams and aspirations. The stage was set, and the intervention of the great powers in the impending World War would soon pour fuel on these smoldering embers, igniting a fire that would burn for more than a century. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered the old empires of Europe and really redrew the map of the modern world. For the Middle East, which had been under the rule of the Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries, the war was a moment of profound transformation. The Ottomans sided with Germany and the Central Powers, putting them in direct opposition to the Allied forces of Britain, France, and Russia. This presented a unique opportunity for both the Zionist movement and the burgeoning Arab nationalist movement. Each side saw the potential to align with the British against the Ottomans, hoping to be rewarded with their long-held national aspirations once the war was won. The British, for their part, were eager to exploit these ambitions for their own strategic advantage. In their effort to weaken the Ottoman front, the British made a series of calculated and ultimately contradictory promises to different groups. To the Arabs, they offered the prospect of a great unified Arab kingdom, free from Turkish rule. Through a series of letters between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the leader of the Hashemite clan, Britain implied that it would support Arab independence in the majority of Ottoman Arab territories in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Turks. Believing they had secured a promise that included Palestine, Arab forces, famously aided by the British officer T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, launched their rebellion in 1916, playing a crucial role in the Allied war effort in the region. At the very same time, the British were also engaged in secret negotiations with the Zionist movement. Zionist leaders, particularly the chemist and diplomat Chaim Weizmann, lobbied tirelessly in London, arguing that a Jewish presence in Palestine aligned with British imperial interests. They presented Zionism as a way to secure a friendly pro-Western entity guarding the strategic Suez Canal. This lobbying effort culminated on November 2, 1917, with the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. In a short letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, the British government declared its support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, which was a monumental victory for the Zionist cause. The declaration, however, contained a crucial and ambiguous caveat, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. To the Arabs, who constituted over 90% of the population, this was a stunning betrayal. Their land had been promised away by a European power to a third party without their knowledge or consent. To compound the duplicity, Britain had also secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, carving up the future of the post-Ottoman Arab world between them into spheres of influence. Britain had effectively promised the same land to 3 different parties: the Arabs, the Jews, and themselves. These conflicting commitments set the stage for decades of bitterness and conflict. When World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the promises of independence made to the Arabs were quickly cast aside. Instead of gaining their freedom, the former Ottoman territories were divided between Britain and France under a new colonial framework known as the Mandate System, approved by the newly formed League of Nations. France took control of Syria and Lebanon, while Britain was granted the mandate for Palestine and Transjordan, which is modern-day Jordan. The official purpose of the mandate was to guide the local population toward self-government. In reality, it was a thinly veiled form of colonial rule. And for Palestine, the British were explicitly tasked with implementing the Balfour Declaration and facilitating the creation of a Jewish national home. Under British administration, Zionist immigration, which had slowed during the war, began to accelerate dramatically. New waves of Jewish immigrants, primarily from Poland and Russia, arrived throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The Zionist organizations, now operating with official British sanction, continued to purchase land and build the institutions of a state-in-waiting. The Jewish population grew from less than 10% of the total in 1918 to nearly 30% by the mid-1930s. Hebrew became an official language alongside English and Arabic. A separate Jewish economy, educational system, and political assembly, known as the Vaad Leumi, were established, creating a vibrant and self-sufficient community that operated almost entirely independently from the Arab majority. For Palestinian Arabs, the Mandate period was a time of growing alarm and political frustration. They watched as their demographic majority steadily eroded and as more and more land was transferred to Jewish ownership. Their appeals to the British for self-determination, based on the principle of majority rule, were consistently denied. They saw the British as actively siding with the Zionist project at their expense. This sense of powerlessness and betrayal fueled a series of violent outbreaks. Riots erupted in Jerusalem in 1920 and Jaffa in 1921. In 1929, a dispute over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem exploded into widespread violence across the country, resulting in the deaths of 133 Jews and 116 Arabs. The tensions reached their peak between 1936 and 1939 with the Great Arab Revolt. This was a sustained countrywide nationalist uprising against both British rule and Zionist immigration. It began with a general strike and escalated into a guerrilla war, with Arab militants attacking British infrastructure and Jewish settlements. The British responded with overwhelming force, employing harsh counterinsurgency tactics, including mass arrests, collective punishment, and house demolitions. By the time the revolt was crushed, thousands of Arabs had been killed and the Palestinian leadership was decimated, either killed, arrested, or exiled. The revolt failed to achieve its goals, but it laid bare the irreconcilable ambitions of the two communities and showed really that British control over a land on edge was becoming untenable. As Europe descended into darkness under Nazi rule, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, an atrocity that forever changed Jewish history. The world's indifference to Jewish suffering convinced many that only a sovereign Jewish state could guarantee safety. After the war, Jewish survivors, stateless and homeless, sought refuge in Palestine, but British immigration restrictions blocked their way. This led to a Jewish insurgency against British rule, as underground groups fought to open Palestine's gates. The conflict escalated, and Britain, exhausted and unable to control the violence, decided to withdraw. The stage was set for a new and volatile chapter in the land's history. By 1947, Britain handed the fate of Palestine to the United Nations. The UN proposed partition 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews, though only a third of the population, were allocated the majority of the land, including the Negev desert. The Jewish community accepted the plan with mixed feelings. The Arab world rejected it outright, seeing it as a grave injustice. Celebrations and outrage erupted in equal measure. The UN had no means to enforce its decision. War was now inevitable. Violence exploded as the British withdrew, and civil war raged between Jews and Arabs. In May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel. The next day, 5 Arab armies invaded, launching the First Arab-Israeli War. For Jews, it was independence. For Palestinians, the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled, their villages destroyed or depopulated. The Deir Yassin massacre became a symbol of the terror fueling the exodus. The war redrew the map and left deep scars on both peoples. The 1949 armistice ended the fighting, but not the conflict. Israel now controlled 78% of former Mandate Palestine. The rest was split between Jordan and Egypt. The Palestinian refugee crisis began with hundreds of thousands living in camps barred from returning home. Israel passed laws seizing refugee property, erasing over 400 villages. Palestinians mourned the Nakba. Israelis faced the challenge of absorbing new immigrants and surviving in a hostile region. The 1949 borders were temporary lines in an unresolved struggle. Two opposing narratives, independence and dispossession, would define generations. The armistice brought only a tense pause. Arab states refused to recognize Israel, and border clashes persisted. In 1956, Egypt's Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, triggering a secret alliance between Israel, Britain, and France. Israel invaded Sinai, Britain and France intervened, but global outrage, especially from the US and USSR, forced a withdrawal. Nasser emerged stronger, but Israel secured access to the Straits of Tiran. The Suez Crisis revealed shifting global power and deepened regional divisions. The conflict's roots remained unresolved. The Middle East was set for further upheaval. The decade following the Suez Crisis was a period of tense, simmering hostility. The Arab world, led by Nasser, continued its bellicose rhetoric, vowing to eventually destroy Israel. A new source of friction emerged over control of the headwaters of the Jordan River, a vital water source for Israel, Jordan, and Syria. Meanwhile, both sides were engaged in a massive arms race, with the Soviet Union supplying advanced weaponry to Egypt and Syria, while Israel cultivated closer ties with the West, particularly France. By the spring of 1967, the region was a powder keg. A series of escalating border clashes with Syria, coupled with false Soviet intelligence reports of an impending Israeli invasion of Syria, prompted Nasser to take a series of fateful steps. In May 1967, Nasser ratcheted up the pressure to a breaking point. He demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations peacekeeping forces that had patrolled the Sinai since the 1956 war, and the UN complied. He then marched his army into the now unbuffered Sinai Peninsula, right up to Israel's border. In his most provocative move, he once again announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to all Israeli shipping, an act that Israel had long stated it would consider a casus belli, an act of war. Arab leaders across the region were swept up in a wave of war fever, with radio broadcasts filled with threats to wipe Israel off the map. Israel found itself surrounded with armies mobilizing on its southern, eastern and northern borders. The sense of impending doom was, honestly, palpable. Convinced that a coordinated Arab attack was imminent and that their national survival was at stake, Israel's leaders decided they had no choice but to launch a preemptive strike. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force executed a stunningly successful surprise attack. In just a few hours, they destroyed the vast majority of the Egyptian Air Force while its planes were still on the ground. With control of the skies secured, the Israeli ground forces launched a multi-front assault. What followed was one of the most swift and decisive military victories in modern history. The war, which the world expected to be a long and bloody affair, was over in just 6 days, leaving the Arab world in a state of shock and disbelief. The scale of Israel's victory was honestly breathtaking. In the south, the Israeli army captured the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, reaching the Suez Canal. In the east, after Jordan entered the war and began shelling West Jerusalem, Israeli forces counterattacked and captured the entire West Bank, and most significantly, the old city of East Jerusalem. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, the holiest sites in Judaism, including the Western Wall, were under Jewish control. In the north, Israeli troops stormed and seized the strategic Golan Heights from Syria, a plateau from which Syrian artillery had shelled Israeli farms for years. In less than a week, Israel had tripled the territory under its control and shattered the military power of its neighbors. The victory in the Six-Day War was met with euphoria and a profound sense of relief in Israel. The existential threat seemed to have been vanquished. The country now had strategic depth, with its armies positioned far from its major population centers. The reunification of Jerusalem in particular was an event of immense emotional and religious significance, seen by many as a moment of messianic fulfillment. However, this stunning military triumph came with a new and enormously complex set of problems that would define the conflict for all the decades to come. With its newly conquered territories, Israel now found itself in control of the lives of over 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This was the beginning of the Israeli occupation. The Palestinians in these territories were not granted Israeli citizenship. They found themselves living under Israeli military rule, their lives governed by military orders. They had no say in the government that controlled their land, their movement, and their economy. For the Palestinians, the 1967 war was a second catastrophe, which they called the Naksa, or the setback. It brought another wave of displacement, with some 300,000 people fleeing the West Bank to Jordan. For those who remained, it marked the start of a new chapter of dispossession, as Israel soon began to establish Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, a policy seen by Palestinians and much of the world as a violation of international law. In the aftermath of the war, the international community sought to find a diplomatic formula for peace. In November 1967, the UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 242. This resolution became the cornerstone of all subsequent peace efforts. It was based on a simple but powerful principle: land for peace. It called for the withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, and in return, for the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. It laid out a vision for a comprehensive peace settlement. However, the resolution was deliberately ambiguous. The English text called for withdrawal from territories, not from all the territories, a linguistic nuance that Israel interpreted as meaning it did not have to return to the pre-1967 lines. The Arab states insisted on a full withdrawal from every inch of occupied land, before they would consider making peace. Furthermore, Resolution 242 was deeply flawed from a Palestinian perspective. It made no mention of Palestinian national rights or self-determination. It referred to them only as a refugee problem, failing to address their political aspirations. The Arab states rejected direct negotiations, famously declaring at a summit in Khartoum their three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. The diplomatic impasse was unfortunately complete. After the devastating defeat of 1967, Israel developed a sense of military invincibility, a belief that its qualitative military edge was so great that the Arab states would not dare to launch another major war. This confidence, which honestly bordered on hubris, was known as the concept. It held that Israel's powerful air force and its fortified positions along the Suez Canal, the Bar-Lev Line, and in the Golan Heights were enough to deter any attack. The country grew comfortable with the new status quo of occupation, believing it could hold on to the territories indefinitely without facing a serious challenge. Meanwhile, Egypt and Syria were seething from their humiliation and secretly planning to shatter this Israeli confidence and reclaim their lost lands. The new Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Nasser in 1970, believed that the diplomatic stalemate could only be broken by military action. He concluded that even a limited military success would be enough to restore Arab pride and force the superpowers to broker a more favorable political settlement. He coordinated a plan with Syria for a surprise two-front attack. They chose the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to launch their assault. On October 6, 1973, as most Israelis were fasting and praying in synagogues, and with the army at a low level of readiness, the attack began. Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal, overwhelming the Bar-Lev Line, while Syrian tanks poured into the Golan Heights. For Israel, the first few days of the war were a near disaster. The country was caught completely by surprise, its intelligence services having failed to correctly interpret the signs of the impending attack. The IDF suffered heavy casualties, losing tanks and planes at an alarming rate to new Soviet-made anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. The myth of Israeli invincibility was shattered. For a moment, it really seemed as if the state itself was in peril. A desperate, full-scale mobilization of reservists was launched and the government appealed to the United States for help. President Richard Nixon, despite some initial hesitation, authorized a massive emergency airlift of military supplies to Israel, an operation that was crucial in turning the tide of the war. After the initial shock, the Israeli military regrouped and launched a series of ferocious counteroffensives. On the northern front, they managed to push the Syrian forces back from the Golan Heights and advanced to within striking distance of Damascus. In the south, in a daring operation, Israeli forces led by General Ariel Sharon crossed to the west bank of the Suez Canal, encircling the entire Egyptian Third Army. The war ended after 3 weeks with a UN-brokered ceasefire, with Israeli forces in a commanding military position. However, the psychological impact was profound. While a military victory, the war was seen as a political and intelligence failure for Israel. For the Arabs, particularly Egypt, the initial successes restored a sense of dignity and honor, paving the way for Sadat to later pursue a path of peace. While the Arab states were fighting wars against Israel, the Palestinian people were beginning to take their national struggle into their own hands. For 2 decades after the Nakba, the Palestinian cause had been largely co-opted by Arab governments, who used it for their own political purposes without making any real progress toward Palestinian liberation. The devastating Arab defeat in the 1967 war was a turning point. It discredited the pan-Arab leadership of figures like Nasser, and convinced many Palestinians that they could not rely on the Arab states to win back their homeland for them. A new sense of Palestinian self-reliance emerged, and with it, the rise of an organization that would come to embody their national aspirations. This organization was the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. It was actually founded in 1964 at the behest of the Arab League, initially as a way for Arab governments to control Palestinian political activity. However, after the 1967 war, it was taken over by independent Palestinian guerrilla factions. The most prominent of these factions was Fatah, led by a charismatic and pragmatic engineer named Yasser Arafat. In 1969, Arafat was elected chairman of the PLO, a position he would hold for the next 35 years. Under his leadership, the PLO transformed into a powerful umbrella organization, a government in exile that claimed to be the sole, legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO's initial strategy was one of armed struggle. From its bases in neighboring Jordan, Fatah and other factions launched raids and attacks against Israeli targets, both military and civilian. While these attacks had little strategic impact on Israel, they succeeded in bringing the Palestinian cause back to the world's attention. In the eyes of many Palestinians, the Fedayeen, or freedom fighters, were heroes, resisting occupation and fighting for their rights. To Israelis and much of the West, however, they were terrorists. The PLO's use of tactics like airline hijackings, bombings, and most notoriously, the massacre of 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, drew widespread international condemnation and solidified Israel's refusal to ever negotiate with them. The PLO's growing military presence in Jordan created a state within a state, challenging the authority of King Hussein. This led to a bloody civil war in 1970, known as Black September, in which the Jordanian army crushed the PLO fighters and expelled them from the country. The PLO leadership and thousands of its fighters relocated to Lebanon, a move that would have devastating consequences for that country. Despite these setbacks, the PLO's political influence grew. In 1974, the Arab League officially recognized the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinians, and in a landmark moment, Yasser Arafat was invited to address the UN General Assembly, famously declaring, "I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun." The expulsion from Jordan and the move to Lebanon marked a new phase for the PLO. Southern Lebanon became Fatah land, a base from which the PLO continued to launch cross-border attacks into northern Israel. This in turn provoked heavy Israeli retaliatory strikes and two major invasions of Lebanon, in 1978 and 1982. The 1982 Lebanon War, aimed at destroying the PLO's military infrastructure once and for all, led to the siege of Beirut and the eventual evacuation of Arafat and his fighters to Tunisia, scattering the PLO leadership far from Palestine. The war also resulted in the horrific Sabra and Shatila massacre, where Christian Falangist militias, allied with Israel, killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians in refugee camps, an event that sent shockwaves of revulsion around the world. While the PLO was engaged in its armed struggle from outside, a new form of resistance began to brew within the occupied territories themselves. By the late 1980s, a new generation of Palestinians had grown up who had known nothing but Israeli occupation. Their frustration with the daily humiliations of military rule, the checkpoints, the land confiscations, the arrests, and the lack of any political progress reached a boiling point. In December 1987, a traffic accident in Gaza involving an Israeli military vehicle that killed 4 Palestinians ignited a spontaneous popular uprising. This uprising became known as the First Intifada, an Arabic word meaning shaking off. It was a mass movement that would change the dynamics of the conflict forever. The First Intifada was largely a grassroots rebellion, characterized not by guerrilla warfare, but by civil disobedience, mass protests, general strikes, and most famously, by Palestinian youths throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The images of David versus Goliath confrontations were broadcast across the globe, dramatically shifting international perceptions of the conflict. The Palestinians were no longer seen merely as a refugee problem or as terrorists, but as a people actively fighting for their freedom against a powerful military occupier. Israel's response, using harsh measures including live ammunition to quell the protests, drew significant international criticism and put immense pressure on its government. The Intifada had profound consequences. It demonstrated to Israel that the occupation was not sustainable and came at a high moral and political cost. It also shifted the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement from the exiled leadership in Tunisia back to the people in the West Bank and Gaza. It was during this period that a new rival Palestinian organization emerged, Hamas. Founded in 1987 as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas presented an Islamist alternative to the secular nationalism of the PLO, rejecting any negotiation with Israel and advocating for its destruction. The Intifada had put the Palestinian people, their resistance and their divisions, firmly at the center of the conflict, setting the stage for the first real attempts at peace in the 1990s. As the Arab states grappled with the aftermath of their repeated defeats by Israel, a seismic event was unfolding in a non-Arab nation that would fundamentally reorder the political landscape of the Middle East. This nation was Iran, a country with a proud and ancient Persian history, distinct from its Arab neighbors in language, culture, and its adherence to the Shia branch of Islam. For decades, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran had been a pillar of American strategy in the region, a staunchly pro-Western monarchy that maintained a surprisingly cooperative, if quiet, relationship with the State of Israel. They shared intelligence, engaged in trade, and saw a common enemy in the radical pan-Arab nationalism being promoted by figures like Egypt's Nasser. This era of pragmatic alignment came to a sudden and dramatic end in 1979. After years of growing internal discontent, the Shah was overthrown in a popular uprising that swept a new and radical force to power, the Islamic Revolution. Led by the exiled Shia cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the revolution transformed Iran from a secularizing, US-backed monarchy into the world's first modern Islamic republic. The new regime was built on a foundation of two core principles: fierce devotion to Shia Islamic governance and a powerful, uncompromising anti-imperialism, which targeted the United States, labeled the Great Satan, as its primary foe. This revolutionary fervor would completely redefine Iran's foreign policy and its role in the world. One of the most immediate and stark reversals in policy concerned Israel. Almost overnight, Israel went from being a discrete regional partner to being branded as an irreconcilable enemy. Ayatollah Khomeini declared Israel an illegitimate entity, a little Satan, and an insidious, cancerous tumor planted in the heart of the Muslim world by Western colonial powers. All diplomatic and economic ties were severed. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was shut down and ceremoniously handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, a symbolic gesture that signaled Iran's new self-appointed role as the chief patron of the Palestinian cause. This was not merely a political pivot, it was an ideological crusade. This transformation marked the beginning of a new and far more complex phase of the wider Middle East conflict. The central axis of confrontation was no longer just between Israel and its immediate Arab neighbors, who were slowly and begrudgingly beginning to consider the possibility of peace. A new, long-distance and ideologically driven rivalry had been born between the Jewish state and the Persian Islamic Republic. This was not a conflict over borders or territory, but a clash of two regional powers with competing visions for the future of the Middle East. Iran's new revolutionary government was determined to export its ideology and challenge the US-led order, and it saw confronting Israel as the primary vehicle for achieving this goal. Iran's profound hostility toward Israel is often misunderstood in the West as being driven solely by religious fanaticism. While the ideological and religious dimensions are undeniably important, Tehran's anti-Israel stance is also rooted in a cold, calculated geopolitical strategy. For the leaders of the Islamic Republic, Israel is not just a state they find religiously and politically objectionable. It is the cornerstone of American power and influence in the Middle East. They view Israel as a permanent US military and intelligence outpost, a forward base for Western imperialism that serves to keep the region's Arab states weak, divided, and subordinate to American interests. Therefore, in the eyes of Tehran, challenging and weakening Israel is a direct way to challenge and weaken the United States. This strategy also serves a crucial domestic and regional purpose. By positioning itself as the most militant champion of the Palestinian cause, Iran seeks to win hearts and minds across the entire Muslim world, transcending the historical divide between Shia and Sunni Muslims. While Sunni Arab governments like those in Egypt and Jordan were making peace with Israel and others were moving toward normalization, Iran's leaders saw a vacuum. They could claim the mantle of the true defenders of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. This allows them to project influence far beyond their borders, gain popular legitimacy on the Arab street, and expose the perceived hypocrisy of Arab regimes that they accuse of betraying the Palestinians. This posture allows Iran to frame its regional ambitions not as Persian expansionism, but as a noble struggle for justice. When Iran supports its allies in Lebanon, Syria, or Yemen, it casts these actions as part of a broader axis of resistance against Zionist and American hegemony. This narrative helps to obscure the more sectarian and imperial aspects of its foreign policy. It is a powerful tool for recruitment, and for justifying its significant investment in military and paramilitary groups across the region. The Palestinian cause becomes a unifying banner under which Iran can rally diverse groups, providing a powerful ideological glue for its network of allies and proxies, regardless of their own local agendas. Furthermore, Iran's opposition to Israel is a core element of its revolutionary identity. The 1979 revolution was built on the idea of resisting oppression and standing up for the Mostazafin, or the dispossessed. The Palestinians are cast as the ultimate symbol of this dispossession. To abandon their cause would be to betray the very founding principles of the Islamic Republic. This makes the anti-Israel position extremely durable and resistant to change, as it is deeply woven into the regime's political DNA. It is a tool for maintaining revolutionary fervor at home, and a strategic lever for projecting power abroad, a combination that has made the Iran-Israel conflict one of the most dangerous and intractable in the world today. Realizing that a direct conventional war with a nuclear-armed and US-backed Israel was impossible and honestly suicidal, Iran developed a more sophisticated and deniable strategy: proxy warfare. Over the course of 4 decades, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, particularly its elite Quds force, has meticulously built, funded, trained and armed a network of allied militias and political movements across the Middle East. This network, which Iran calls the Axis of Resistance, allows Tehran to wage a war against Israel from multiple fronts by remote control, creating a ring of fire around its adversary while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. It is a low-cost, high-impact strategy that has profoundly reshaped regional security. The crown jewel of this proxy network is Hezbollah, the Party of God, in Lebanon. Founded with Iranian assistance in the early 1980s to fight the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah has evolved into the most powerful non-state military actor in the world. It is a hybrid organization, with a political wing that participates in Lebanese government and a formidable military wing that is better armed than many national armies. Iran has supplied Hezbollah with a massive arsenal of tens of thousands of rockets and precision-guided missiles, capable of striking any target inside Israel. This arsenal acts as a powerful deterrent, creating a balance of terror on Israel's northern border, and giving Iran a potent retaliatory capability. In the Palestinian territories, Iran found a willing partner in Hamas, the Islamist group that controls the Gaza Strip. Although Hamas is a Sunni organization and an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, the old adage, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," applies. Iran has provided Hamas and its smaller ally, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, with funding, weapons technology and training. This support has enabled these groups to develop their rocket capabilities and build a vast network of underground tunnels, allowing them to sustain conflicts with Israel from the south. By backing these groups, Iran ensures that Israel remains bogged down in the Palestinian conflict, draining its resources and international standing. The chaos that followed the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq and the Syrian civil war in 2011 provided fertile ground for Iran to expand its proxy network even further. In Iraq, Iran sponsors powerful Shia militias that have attacked U.S. forces and can threaten Israel from the east. In Syria, Iran intervened decisively to save the regime of its ally, Bashar al-Assad, establishing a permanent military foothold in the country. This created a land bridge connecting Tehran directly to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Further afield, Iran has backed the Houthi movement in Yemen, which, despite its distance, has demonstrated the ability to launch long-range missiles and drones toward Israel, threatening shipping in the vital Red Sea. This multi-front network poses a constant, low-grade, and strategically complex threat to Israel's security. Unable to engage in open warfare, Israel and Iran have been locked for years in a clandestine and deadly conflict fought in the shadows. This undeclared war takes place across the globe, utilizing spies, special forces, cyber weapons, and targeted assassinations. It's really a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, where each side seeks to sabotage the other's capabilities, disrupt its operations, and eliminate key personnel, all while avoiding a direct military confrontation that could escalate into a full-scale regional war. This shadow war is a constant, simmering undercurrent to the more visible proxy conflicts, with operations often only coming to light through media leaks or anonymous official briefings. Israel, widely believed to possess one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies, the Mossad, has focused its covert efforts primarily on thwarting Iran's military and nuclear ambitions. This has allegedly involved a series of daring and mysterious operations deep inside Iranian territory. High-ranking Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated in broad daylight on the streets of Tehran, often by motorcycle-riding assailants. Key military commanders, including senior figures in the IRGC, have been eliminated in targeted strikes. Strategic facilities such as missile bases and drone factories have been struck by mysterious explosions and fires, events that Iran attributes to Israeli sabotage. The goal of this campaign is to slow down Iran's military progress and sow paranoia within its security establishment. Cyber warfare has become a major front in this shadow conflict. Both nations possess advanced cyber capabilities and have reportedly targeted each other's critical national infrastructure. One of the most famous examples was the Stuxnet computer worm, a highly complex piece of malware discovered in 2010 that is widely believed to have been a joint US-Israeli creation. Stuxnet specifically targeted and physically destroyed centrifuges at Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility, setting back its nuclear program significantly. In retaliation, Iran has been accused of launching cyber attacks against Israeli water systems, government websites and private companies, demonstrating that the digital battlefield is as important as the physical one. This shadow war also extends across the region, particularly in Syria, which has become the primary arena for direct, albeit unacknowledged, Israeli-Iranian clashes. The Israeli Air Force has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the last decade, a campaign it calls the war between the wars. These strikes target Iranian weapons shipments destined for Hezbollah, Iranian military bases, and the positions of Iran-backed militias. Iran, in turn, uses its proxies to launch drones or rockets toward Israeli territory in response. Each strike and counterstrike is a carefully calibrated move, designed to send a message and inflict damage without crossing the threshold that would trigger an all-out war. It is a dangerous, undeclared battle that constantly risks miscalculation and uncontrollable escalation. While the proxy armies and the shadow war pose significant threats, there is one issue that stands above all others in Israel's strategic calculus: Iran's nuclear program. For Israel's entire security establishment, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic is not just a threat, it is an existential red line that cannot be crossed. An Iranian nuclear bomb, they argue, would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East, threatening the very existence of the Jewish state. They point to the explicit threats made by Iranian leaders to wipe Israel off the map and view a nuclear weapon in their hands as the potential means to carry out that threat. A nuclear-armed Iran would present Israel with an impossible strategic dilemma. It would create a nuclear umbrella under which Iran's proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas could operate with much greater impunity, emboldened by the knowledge that any massive Israeli retaliation could risk a nuclear exchange. This would severely constrain Israel's freedom of action and its ability to defend itself against conventional threats. Furthermore, it would likely trigger a nuclear arms race across the Middle East, with other regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey feeling compelled to develop their own nuclear weapons to counter Iran, creating an incredibly volatile and unstable region bristling with atomic weapons. In response to this perceived existential threat, Israel has pursued a multi-pronged strategy. Diplomatically, it has lobbied relentlessly in international forums, particularly in Washington, for crippling sanctions and maximum pressure to force Iran to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. Covertly, as discussed, it has engaged in a campaign of sabotage and assassination to physically degrade and delay the program. Militarily, Israel has made it clear that it reserves the right to take preemptive action to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities if it believes diplomacy has failed, much as it did when it destroyed Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 and a suspected Syrian reactor in 2007. The threat of an Israeli military strike has loomed over the region for years. The international community attempted to resolve the crisis in 2015 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, which placed temporary restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Israel vehemently opposed the deal, arguing it was too weak, and its sunset clauses would eventually pave a legitimate path for Iran to obtain a bomb. The U.S. withdrawal from the deal in 2018 at the urging of Israel, and Iran's subsequent acceleration of its uranium enrichment to near weapons-grade levels, has brought the crisis back to a boiling point. The nuclear question remains the most dangerous flashpoint in the conflict, a ticking clock that could one day force Israel to make a fateful decision with consequences for the entire world. Tucked away in the southwestern corner of Israel, bordering Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea, lies one of the most contested and troubled pieces of land on the planet. This is the Gaza Strip. It is a tiny sliver of territory, only about 41 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, yet it is home to over 2 million Palestinians. This makes it one of the most densely populated places in the entire world, a narrow, crowded corridor packed with cities, towns, and sprawling refugee camps. The story of modern Gaza is a story of dispossession, occupation, and isolation, a tragic narrative that has made it a symbol of the Palestinian struggle and a constant flashpoint for violence in the broader conflict. The demographic reality of Gaza is a direct legacy of the 1948 Nakba. The vast majority of its residents, over 70%, are registered refugees, or the descendants of refugees who fled or were expelled from their homes in what is now Israel. They have lived for generations in crowded camps, holding on to the memory of lost villages and the dream of return. From 1948 to 1967, Gaza was under Egyptian military administration. Then, following the Six-Day War, it fell under Israeli military occupation, along with the West Bank. For nearly 4 decades, the Israeli army controlled life within the Strip, and Jewish settlements were established on its land, creating a constant source of friction and resentment among the local population. A significant shift occurred in 2005 when Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon initiated a controversial policy of unilateral disengagement. The Israeli army withdrew all of its soldiers and forcibly evacuated approximately 9,000 Jewish settlers from the Gaza Strip. For a fleeting moment, there was a glimmer of hope that this withdrawal could be a step toward a more peaceful future, perhaps a model for a future Palestinian state. However, this hope was quickly extinguished by the political earthquake that followed. The power vacuum created by the Israeli withdrawal was not filled by the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority, but by its more radical Islamist rival, setting the stage for Gaza's complete isolation. This isolation became formalized and absolute after a brief but violent Palestinian civil war in 2007. The Islamist movement Hamas violently seized full control of the Gaza Strip, ousting the forces of the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority. In response, Israel and Egypt imposed a comprehensive and crushing blockade on the territory, controlling its borders, its coastline, and its airspace. Israel declared Gaza a hostile entity, and from that point on, the movement of people and goods in and out of the Strip was severely restricted. This blockade, which continues to this day, has been described by human rights organizations and UN officials as a form of collective punishment, effectively turning Gaza into what many have called the world's largest open-air prison. To understand the events of 2023, it is crucial to understand the organization at the center of the storm, Hamas. The name is actually an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, and it was founded back in 1987 at the start of the First Intifada. Hamas emerged as an offshoot of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, an influential Islamist movement that was founded in Egypt. From its inception, Hamas really presented itself as a religious alternative to the secular nationalism of Yasser Arafat's PLO. Its founding charter, published in 1988, was, honestly, uncompromising. It called for the destruction of the State of Israel through jihad, and the establishment of an Islamic state across all of historic Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Hamas operates as a complex hybrid organization. It has a political wing that engages in governance and diplomacy, and a social wing that provides services like schools, clinics, and welfare programs to the impoverished population of Gaza, a key source of its popular support. But at its core is a highly secretive and disciplined military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades. Designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, the European Union, and other countries, this armed wing has been responsible for carrying out hundreds of attacks against Israelis, including suicide bombings against civilians in the 1990s and 2000s, and a relentless campaign of rocket fire from the Gaza Strip. Since seizing control of Gaza in 2007, Hamas has been locked in a state of perpetual conflict with Israel. This has resulted in a devastating and, honestly, predictable cycle of violence. Hamas and other militant groups fire rockets indiscriminately toward Israeli towns and cities. Israel retaliates with overwhelming military force, launching devastating airstrikes and ground incursions into the densely populated Strip. Major wars erupted in 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021. Each round of fighting left thousands dead, the vast majority of them Palestinian civilians, and reduced large parts of Gaza's infrastructure to rubble. For Israel, these operations were seen as defensive necessities to stop rocket fire. For Gazans, they were terrifying onslaughts that brought only death and destruction. Throughout this period, Hamas honed its military capabilities with significant support from its primary patron, Iran. It built a vast, sophisticated network of underground tunnels, dubbed the Gaza Metro by the IDF, which were used for smuggling weapons, hiding fighters, and launching attacks. It also developed a large arsenal of rockets, graduating from crude homemade projectiles to more advanced, longer-range missiles capable of reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Israel, in turn, invested billions in its Iron Dome missile defense system to intercept these rockets. This created a deadly high-tech stalemate, a cycle of attack and defense that became a grim routine, but one that was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. On the morning of October 7, 2023, the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, the routine of the conflict was broken by an event of shocking brutality and scale. Under the cover of a massive rocket barrage that overwhelmed the Iron Dome system, Hamas launched a meticulously planned and highly coordinated, multi-pronged invasion of southern Israel. It was a stunning intelligence failure for Israel, on par with the surprise of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, but the nature of the violence that followed was something new, and, honestly, far more terrifying. Using explosives and bulldozers, militants breached the high-tech billion-dollar security fence that was supposed to make Gaza impenetrable. They swarmed into Israel by land, sea, and even by air on motorized paragliders. Over 1,500 Hamas fighters poured into Israeli territory, fanning out to attack more than 20 different locations, including military bases, small towns, and kibbutzim. The scenes that unfolded were ones of pure carnage. The militants went from house to house, systematically slaughtering civilians in their homes. Entire families were executed in their beds. They attacked the Supernova Music Festival, an outdoor rave near Kibbutz Re'im, gunning down hundreds of fleeing young people and committing acts of unspeakable cruelty. The violence was not just killing, it was a deliberate massacre, documented and in some cases live-streamed by the attackers themselves, designed to inflict maximum terror and humiliation. By the time the Israeli army, caught completely off guard, was able to mobilize and regain control of the area, the toll was staggering. More than 1,200 people in Israel had been killed, the vast majority of them civilians. It was the single deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, a national trauma that struck at the very core of the Israeli sense of security. The state, which was founded to be a safe haven for Jews, had failed in its most basic duty to protect its citizens within its own borders. The horror was compounded by another element of Hamas's plan, the taking of hostages. In addition to the massacre, Hamas fighters abducted more than 240 people and dragged them back into the Gaza Strip. The hostages included babies and young children, women and the elderly and foreign nationals. They were a mix of civilians and soldiers, their faces soon plastered on missing posters all over Israel and around the world. The hostage crisis added a layer of agonizing uncertainty and emotional torment to the national grief. For Israel, the events of October 7th were not just another round of conflict. They were a declaration of a different kind of war, a barbaric assault that, in the eyes of its leaders and much of its population, demanded a response of unprecedented force. The shock and rage that swept through Israel in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre were immediate and overwhelming. The country was united in grief and a burning desire for retribution. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel was at war, and the country's leaders vowed to achieve a goal that had never been attempted in previous conflicts: the complete and utter destruction of Hamas. The stated objectives were clear: to dismantle Hamas's military and governing capabilities so that it could never again threaten Israel, and to secure the return of all the hostages. This was to be a war not of containment or deterrence, but of annihilation. The Israeli military response began within hours. It launched what would become one of the most intense and destructive aerial bombing campaigns in modern history. Airstrikes pounded the Gaza Strip relentlessly, day and night. Israel said it was targeting Hamas infrastructure, command centers, weapons depots, and the vast tunnel network that ran beneath the city. But Hamas had deliberately embedded this infrastructure deep within densely populated civilian areas, beneath schools, mosques, apartment buildings, and hospitals. As a result, the bombardment caused civilian casualties on a scale that dwarfed all previous rounds of fighting combined. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, reduced to seas of gray rubble. After several weeks of airstrikes, Israel launched a full-scale ground invasion, first in northern Gaza and later expanding to the south. Tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers, backed by tanks and armored bulldozers, pushed deep into Gaza's urban centers, engaging in fierce, close-quarters combat with Hamas fighters. The fighting was brutal, taking place in a hellish landscape of ruined buildings and booby-trapped tunnels. The Israeli military issued evacuation orders for civilians in the north, telling more than 1 million people to move south. But for most Gazans, there was nowhere safe to go. The borders were sealed, and Israeli strikes were hitting areas throughout the Strip, including in the designated safe zones. The human cost of this military campaign quickly became catastrophic. The evacuation orders created a massive internal displacement crisis, with hundreds of thousands of terrified people fleeing their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They sought shelter in overcrowded UN schools and hospitals, or in makeshift tent camps that sprang up in the south. These shelters were soon overwhelmed, lacking food, clean water, and medicine. The war was not just destroying Hamas, it was destroying the very fabric of life in Gaza, creating a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions and raising profound questions around the world about the legality and morality of Israel's tactics. As the war raged on through the end of 2023 and into 2024, the death toll in Gaza mounted at a terrifying pace. According to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, whose figures are considered reliable by the UN and other international agencies, the number of Palestinians killed surpassed 20,000, then 30,000, and continued to climb. The ministry reported that approximately 70% of the dead were women and children. Thousands more were missing, presumed buried under the rubble of their homes. Images of wounded children, grieving parents, and overwhelmed doctors in collapsing hospitals circulated globally, sparking outrage and accusations that Israel was committing war crimes and engaging in collective punishment against the entire Palestinian population. The humanitarian situation deteriorated into a full-blown catastrophe. The Israeli blockade, tightened to a complete siege at the start of the war, severely restricted the entry of food, water, medicine, and fuel. The healthcare system completely collapsed. Hospitals became battlegrounds, with many being besieged, raided, or forced to evacuate by the Israeli military, which claimed they were being used by Hamas as command centers. Famine began to loom as the population faced starvation. International aid agencies described the conditions as apocalyptic, warning of the imminent risk of mass death from disease and hunger, in addition to the violence of the war itself. The war caused deep and bitter divisions across the globe. Israel's staunchest allies, particularly the United States, initially offered ironclad support for its right to self-defense, rushing military aid and providing diplomatic cover at the UN. However, as the civilian death toll skyrocketed, even the United States began to express concerns and urge more restraint. In the Arab world, there was widespread popular anger and condemnation, but official government reactions were largely muted, reflecting a complex geopolitical landscape where some Arab leaders also viewed Hamas as a threat. Massive pro-Palestinian protests erupted in cities across the world, from London and New York to Jakarta and Johannesburg, demanding an immediate ceasefire. The conflict also became a fierce battle of narratives. Supporters of Israel pointed to the unprovoked barbarity of the October 7th attacks, arguing that Israel had no choice but to dismantle a terrorist organization that had vowed to repeat its atrocities. They accused critics of ignoring Hamas's use of human shields and its genocidal charter. On the other side, critics accused Israel of using October 7th as a pretext to carry out a long-planned ethnic cleansing of Gaza. The rhetoric grew increasingly polarized, with South Africa formally accusing Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice. The war had not only devastated Gaza, but it had also reignited a global debate about the very nature of the conflict, leaving the path to any form of peace or reconciliation more distant than ever. As we stand in the midst of 2024, surveying the wreckage of the most recent war, it becomes painfully clear that the Israel-Palestine conflict is trapped in a devastating and self-perpetuating cycle. Each outbreak of violence, no matter how it begins, seems to follow a tragically predictable pattern. An act of resistance or attack by a Palestinian group is met with a massive and disproportionate military response from Israel. This response inflicts widespread destruction and civilian casualties in Palestine, which is then broadcast to a horrified world. This, in turn, fuels global condemnation of Israel, deepens Palestinian despair and anger, and often bolsters the popularity and resolve of militant groups, ensuring that the seeds of the next confrontation are sown even before the dust has settled on the current one. This cycle is fueled by deeply entrenched and irreconcilable narratives of victimhood and justice on both sides. For many Israelis, their nation's history is one of constant struggle against annihilation, from the Holocaust to the threats of hostile neighbors. Every act of war is framed as a necessary defense of their very existence, a fight for survival in a region that has long sought their destruction. The trauma of events like the October 7th massacre reinforces this worldview, justifying actions that, to the outside world, may seem excessive. This perspective sees compromise as a weakness that enemies will exploit, making security through military strength the paramount, and often only, consideration in their national calculus. For Palestinians, the narrative is one of continuous and compounding injustice, beginning with the Nakba in 1948 and continuing through decades of occupation, blockade, and dispossession. Each Israeli military campaign is seen not as a defensive reaction, but as another brutal chapter in a long-running project of colonial oppression designed to crush their national aspirations. From this viewpoint, resistance, including armed struggle, is not terrorism, but a legitimate response to an illegal occupation and a desperate cry for freedom and dignity. The immense suffering endured by their people only deepens the conviction that the world has abandoned them, and that they have no choice but to fight on by any means necessary. The result is a feedback loop of trauma. An Israeli child who grows up running to bomb shelters learns to see the Palestinian as an inherent threat. A Palestinian child who grows up seeing their home destroyed and family members killed learns to see the Israeli soldier as the embodiment of pure evil. This generational trauma hardens identities, erodes empathy, and makes the other a monolithic enemy rather than a complex human being. It closes off the political space needed for moderation and compromise, empowering the most extreme voices on both sides who promise victory through force rather than peace through negotiation. The cycle continues, with each side's actions providing the perfect justification for the other's fears and hatreds. For decades, the international community has held up a single, seemingly logical solution to the conflict: the two-state solution. This framework, rooted in the 1947 UN Partition Plan and later enshrined in agreements like the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, envisions the creation of an independent sovereign state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, existing peacefully alongside the State of Israel. For a time, this was the official goal of negotiations, a shared horizon for peacemakers around the world. It promised to fulfill the national aspirations of both peoples, giving Israelis security in their own state, and Palestinians self-determination and an end to occupation in theirs. It seemed to be the only rational way out of the impasse. Today, however, the two-state solution appears to be on life support, if not already deceased. Decades of failed negotiations, mutual distrust, and most critically, facts on the ground have rendered it nearly impossible to implement. The relentless expansion of Israeli settlements across the West Bank has carved the territory into a patchwork of disconnected Palestinian enclaves, making the creation of a viable, contiguous state a geographical nightmare. Over 700,000 Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, creating a political reality that no Israeli government could easily reverse. This settlement enterprise, seen by Palestinians as a land grab and by most of the world as illegal, has been the single greatest obstacle to a negotiated peace. The political will for a two-state solution has also withered away on both sides. In Israel, the political landscape has shifted dramatically to the right, with many mainstream politicians openly rejecting the idea of Palestinian statehood, viewing it as a security threat that would create a terror state on their doorstep. In Palestine, years of disappointment with the peace process and the continued expansion of settlements have led to a profound loss of faith in negotiations. The internal division between the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip further complicates matters, leaving Israel to claim it has no unified or reliable partner for peace. With the two-state solution fading, alternative visions remain marginal and fraught with their own immense challenges. A one-state solution, in which Israelis and Palestinians would live together as equal citizens in a single democratic binational state, is favored by some on the academic left but is rejected by the vast majority on both sides. For most Israeli Jews, it means the end of the Zionist dream of a Jewish majority state. For many Palestinians, it is a surrender of their own dream of national sovereignty. Without a viable, agreed-upon political framework, the conflict remains locked in a state of indefinite management rather than resolution, a permanent state of crisis with no clear endgame in sight. As we conclude this exploration, it is crucial to move beyond the headlines of war and the failures of politics to acknowledge a fundamental truth. Israelis and Palestinians are two peoples deeply and permanently intertwined. They are not destined to disappear. Neither side can achieve a total victory that erases the other from the map or from history. Their pasts are inextricably linked, their present is a shared struggle, and their future, whether in two states or one, will be lived side by side on the same small sacred and blood-soaked piece of land. Recognizing this shared fate is the first, and perhaps most difficult step toward imagining a different kind of future for the region. This requires a radical act of empathy, a willingness to see the humanity and understand the legitimate fears and aspirations of the other side. It means acknowledging that the Israeli desire for security and a sovereign homeland, born from a history of unimaginable persecution, is real and valid. It also means acknowledging that the Palestinian desire for freedom, dignity, and self-determination in their own state, born from a history of dispossession and occupation, is equally real and valid. These two truths are not mutually exclusive. They are the two pillars upon which any lasting peace must eventually be built. It is a peace that cannot be imposed by outsiders but must grow from within. Despite the overwhelming darkness, flickers of this hope persist. They exist in the small but courageous grassroots organizations of Israelis and Palestinians who refuse to be enemies. They are found in groups of bereaved families from both sides who have lost loved ones to the conflict but come together to advocate for reconciliation instead of revenge. They are present in the work of human rights activists, journalists, and artists who dare to challenge the dominant narratives of hate and division within their own societies. These efforts are often drowned out by the drums of war, but they represent a vital countercurrent, a testament to the enduring human capacity for compassion and the search for common ground. Ultimately, the path forward remains shrouded in uncertainty. The wounds are deep, the grievances are profound, and the political obstacles are monumental. There are no simple answers or easy solutions to a conflict so laden with history, trauma, and competing claims. But the story is not yet over. The future of Israelis and Palestinians has yet to be written. It can be a future of endless war, a perpetual cycle of violence and sorrow, or it can be one where shared suffering finally gives way to a shared recognition of rights, dignity, and humanity. The choice belongs to the people who call that land home, and it is a choice that will reverberate across the entire world. Before war, Syria was a land of ancient cities and vibrant coexistence. Damascus, one of the world's oldest cities, echoed with the footsteps of apostles and caliphs. In Aleppo's bustling souks, the scent of spices mingled with a chorus of dialects, a living legacy of the Silk Road. Syria's society was a mosaic. Sunni and Shia Muslims, Alawites, Christians, Druze, and Kurds lived side by side. The call to prayer and church bells often rang out together, a symbol of fragile but real tolerance. Life was not free. Assad's regime ruled with an iron fist, but there was stability, and people could plan for the future. The economy offered opportunities, and families celebrated traditions together. The idea that this social fabric could unravel so violently seemed unimaginable. Today, the memory of that vibrant, complex Syria is overshadowed by tragedy. To understand the scale of Syria's loss, we must remember the country it once was. The Arab Spring reached Syria in 2011, igniting in the southern city of Daraa. Schoolboys' graffiti criticizing President Assad led to brutal arrests and torture. Outrage spread. Protests erupted, demanding dignity and freedom, not regime change. Assad responded with violence, framing protesters as foreign-backed terrorists. Security forces cracked down and peaceful demonstrations turned deadly. As repression intensified, some Syrians took up arms and defecting soldiers formed the Free Syrian Army. The uprising became a civil war, its original hope drowned in bloodshed. The government's brutality created a power vacuum, drawing in new actors. Syria's conflict was no longer just a fight for freedom. It became a battleground for competing agendas. Civil war brought a humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands died, civilians killed by bombs, snipers and shelling. Over half the population was uprooted. Millions fled abroad or lived as refugees in their own country. Ancient cities like Aleppo and Homs were reduced to rubble. Schools, hospitals and infrastructure were destroyed, making recovery daunting. Children grew up knowing only war, many deprived of education and scarred by trauma. The refugee crisis strained neighboring countries and the world's compassion. The true cost is measured in broken lives and lost futures. Syria's tragedy is not just in what was destroyed but in what was lost forever. Syria's war became a proxy battlefield for global powers. Iran poured in money, troops and militias to keep Assad in power, seeking influence and a link to Hezbollah. Israel, alarmed by Iran's presence, launched airstrikes to prevent a permanent threat on its border. Russia's 2015 intervention turned the tide, securing Assad's rule and Moscow's influence in the region. The US focused on fighting ISIS, backing Kurdish-led forces, angering Turkey, which saw them as terrorists. These tangled alliances deepened Syria's divisions and prolonged the conflict. Foreign powers shaped the war's outcome, but left Syria fractured and dependent. The country became a stage for international rivalry, not just a civil war. By June 2025, major battles have faded, but true peace is elusive. Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, controls most of Syria, but the nation is shattered and impoverished. The economy is in ruins, infrastructure decimated, and millions remain displaced. The war redrew the region's map, empowering Iran and Russia, and fueling a refugee crisis. Sectarian tensions and foreign meddling persist, while ordinary Syrians bear the cost. For them, peace means justice, accountability, and a voice in rebuilding their country. Healing and reconciliation seem distant, but hope endures in the resilience of everyday Syrians. Syria's story is a warning: how quickly a society can unravel, and how global rivalries can fuel catastrophe. As the world moves on, Syrians still dream of restoring their homeland. Their voices must not be forgotten.